Welcome to the Moon Collective Sanctuary. I'm Dr. Lydia Luna, and I invite you to join me on a journey of self-discovery, healing, and transformation as we explore the depths of our inner and outer world to unlock our truest potential. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Moon Collective Sanctuary podcast. My name is Dr. Lydia Luna. I'm a clinical psychologist and founder of the Moon Collective Sanctuary. And today I am joined by Brian Shears, an LMFT. First of all, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, so I'm curious what brought you into this field and to these areas of interest, mindfulness especially.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think struggling to know how to be uh, a teenager and a young man without so much fear. That was really it, I would say. I grew up very much supported by loving parents and a loving family, but there was a lot of mental illness in my family, a lot of trauma. And I was sort of the rock for everybody, but I didn't really have my own rock. And so I started martial arts really, really early. And that was an attempt to try and deal with the anxiety and fear and worry that I had and the social anxiety that I had. And because of that, I kind of found a philosophical way of looking at the body and mind early on. And that was really powerful. So it became kind of my identity for quite a while. And then, of course, you can't fight your way through life. And if you're being taught well, you're learning that you really don't want to fight. You actually want to use your emotional intelligence to get out of difficult situations. And so that led to, how do we do that? How do we actually dive into what makes us aggressive or what makes us afraid? And little did I know that many of my mom's family friends were meditation masters. They just kind of kept it on the down low. And I'd already been exposed to many of them in family events and different weekend kind of experiences. And so I started studying meditation formally when I was 26 and never stopped, never looked back. And so I started teaching meditation classes in 2012. And I realized after about a couple of years that people in my classes were giving me signs they needed deeper help, more support than what the mindfulness classes could offer. And it just made sense that all the people I really looked up to in the field of contemplative psychology were trained in psychology. And so I thought, why not me?
Right.
So I went back to grad school, and years later, here I am.
Well, the reason that I invited you today is because I really want to dive into mental health as it relates to men, right?
Mhm.
We know that suicide is one of the leading causes of death for men, and there just isn't enough mental health support. And my personal experience with this has been that I did lose a loved one to suicide, and he was my boyfriend of almost 5 years. And there were no signs that he was struggling, and I think that's the problem right now is that men suffer like women, they feel like women. We all feel we're just human, but men and, whether it's cultural, societal, men are just not seeking the support. They're not saying when they're struggling and they're just holding everything in. I love for us to dive into, yeah, talking about mental health, the almost like destigmatizing this and seeing how we can better support men. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing, right? To create these spaces to really promote this kind of work with the masculine community.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you. It's a tragic thing, um, what has happened to men in a way, because it's several decades of Western culture. Let's just keep it to America, speaking to men about the need to change, especially as women's rights became more recognized and championed. And, we saw laws change and we saw some of the norms being pushed against. And lots of conversations that happened in the public sphere created a situation where there's kind of a schism for men because I think in the 80s and 90s, there was this sense that, you know, women want a sensitive guy, but then they leave sensitive guys for the bad guys, right? And there's this whole sort of caricaturization of what the evolved masculinity is supposed to look like. And because it was left to pop culture and news columnists and, you know, people who are later on becoming influencers in more modern media times, not having in-depth conversations about what this really is, we're left with lots of people pushing against it and getting hyper masculine. And then we're also finding guys who are trying to do the work but don't know how, and they're confused and they're ashamed of it and exhausted from it. And so I think what we need is deeper conversations
Mhm.
and clarification about things that really, I think when we get into it, really do show how much more men and women have in common as human beings, but also that there's a granularity to this conversation that TikToks and Instagrams and articles just can't get into. And podcasts, I think, are actually the perfect place to get into it because it's long form and we can go wherever we want to. So I'm happy to dive into whatever zone you want to around this. But there's so many things to unpack from this.
Right, right, right. Okay, yeah, so let's dive in. What do you believe are the key factors that make it challenging for men to express vulnerability in relationships, friendships, or even self-reflection?
Yeah. Fundamentally, it's complete lack of education and a perception of non-acceptance. All right. So we have to think about if we take an individual man, what are the influences that shape him, right? And it's going to be genetics, it's going to be the family system, and what are the family values, myths, and rules that are both explicit and implicit as they do life, right? So we're going to learn from mom and dad, from siblings, extended family, but then into that household is pouring all this culture. And so there could be lots of cultural differences depending on the heritage of people, and their socioeconomic class. So all those things factor into where we get messages. So if we look at a broad swath of perspectives on what is appropriate behavior for a boy, a young man, a fully grown adult, male, so much of it comes from warrior culture.
Mm,
And, you know, I'll even back up just for a second because there's something even more important that's true for all of us, men and women, and every individual. And that is that we're born the most vulnerable mammal on the planet. If you compare human babies to any other mammal, human babies are born with almost no instincts whatsoever. So if you put your little finger inside their hand, they can grasp. So that's sort of a safety instinct. And in the beginning, the baby can track mother's voice and proximity, but he can't even track with his eyes yet. So that comes on, days to weeks later, right? So everything else is completely at the mercy of the caregiver. And then you have this really strange human brain, which is a beautiful human brain, but it's very different than other mammals in that those instincts that naturally come on as the infant deer interacts with mother and siblings, the legs come online, they have instinctive ways of finding a nipple to feed, and play comes naturally through interacting with the environment, right? We don't have that at all. Everything that we are has to be learned. And the amazing thing is that the infant, the toddler, the young child doesn't have a choice with that. It's actually nature colliding with nurture to create and activate genetic expression of traits and qualities. And one of those traits is this need to communicate. The infant hears all this language and it wants to be able to do the same thing, to imitate. So language starts coming online, but all those words for things and sounds are starting to collect around a logic that says, if I'm too loud, I get punished. Or if I act this way, I get rewarded. If I cry and this powerful, all knowing person that they're calling dad shames me for crying, I internalize that not as a choice, but as a function of nature being impacted by a kind of nurture. So, warrior culture is handed down from generation to generation in all cultures, to varying degrees, because the only way to survive from our ancestral point of view, and keep in mind that adults didn't live that long, right? So if we go back 200,000 years, they're dying in their 30s from various forms of predation, disease, whatever it is. So the youth had to take over quickly as adolescents.
It's true.
And to learn how to hunt and how to prove yourself was a matter of survival. If you're getting ready to attack an animal that's also being circled by lions and your leg is shaking and you start to urinate, all of your tribesmen are going to look at you as you can get us killed. Shut it down. However, if you look at many different forms of indigenous cultures, they also had a way of together after that event, if that happened, singing or ritualizing or dancing a warrior back into his strength. So, on the one hand, you've got this showing emotion is dangerous, it's weakness, it's inhibition, it's fear. But we've lost the tribal part of that, which actually would teach us about how to do that well. And we would do it together, and we would be brought up together. And so there's a whole different way that our ancestors understood this. So what we've got handed down to us from generation to generation is the worst part of tribal culture, which is don't show fear, but we've lost the community. We've lost a way for boys to be brought up in a field of strength and love and caring and ritual and training. Because again, we're not born with these instincts. We have to learn everything. Everything is learned. So we have generations of men who've been taught that showing emotions is weakness. And because of that, there's been a lack of proper education around it. And the people who've tried to bring that into more of a focus and do the work, like, back in the 70s, Robert Bly and other people trying to bring men into a more of a tribal relationship and more of an open sense of who they are, has been helpful. But I think what's been missing is that there's a lack of precision around the conversation of what are emotions. And I think that's part of the problem about the education is that up until very recently, we really haven't understood what emotions are. And we still are far from, I think, a full understanding. But now we have much better neuroscience to help us understand so that we can get more granular in how we can teach this to men in a way that makes sense to them because it's really skill building.
Mm.
It's not about, are you a tough guy or not a tough guy?
Right.
Are you a wimp or a nerd or a badass? It's more like, what are your skills?
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense to people. And it brings it to something that's manageable and doable and learnable.
That makes sense. Wow. Well, okay, here's another question. Do you think there's a generational difference in how men are taught to deal with their emotions today compared to the past? What are the consequences of these differences on men's mental health? So this almost speaks to this tribal thing, the tribal aspect you were talking about. They did teach that, but it's not happening now.
That's right. I mean, it happens, we also have to remember that we're trying to speak about it broadly.
Right.
And so there are lots and lots of exceptions to the things I'm saying. So there are incredible men's groups. There are incredible, sports teams occasionally. There are coaches who really understand and kind of take the UCLA famous coach John Wooden's approach to developing the scholar athlete rather than just a killer who goes out to get the W. There's a wonderful guy on Instagram who I'd love to alert your audience to named Jason Wilson, who is just extraordinary. He's a black martial arts teacher who specializes in teaching young black boys who are struggling in school, who are struggling with gang violence. And his way of teaching is phenomenal. And he has these little videos that are just exemplifying exactly what we're talking about, which is the need for this to happen in community.
Yeah.
And he's got a wonderful book out called Cry Like a Man. And it's great. It's really great. It's his story, but it's also his wisdom of how to recognize that the dialectical balance between being strong and being vulnerable is actually a synergy as opposed to a plus or a minus, a kind of
Mm-hmm.
black and white opposition. And so that's an example of, a small community where someone has a really good understanding of how to actualize it and functionalize it. But I think back to your fundamental question, the thing that's in the way again is that, you know, if you ask people what emotions are, they're going to have a hard time defining an emotion without using an example like anger, fear, shame, guilt, etc. I can't tell you what an emotion actually is. And that's a problem because if we're going to become emotionally intelligent, we need to know what emotions actually are. And part of the challenge is that we have this scientific conundrum between mind and body. And there isn't a mind-body separation. We know that, right? We can think ourselves into an ulcer. We can think ourselves into a state of parasympathetic calm.
Yes.
So the mind interacts with the body interacts and influences the mind. However, they are two different domains. And the thing I always like to tell people, which is really important because, again, we have a lot of assumptions and beliefs about human condition. And the mind is so difficult, like our work is so difficult because of the nature of the mind. There's only one way to do a quadruple bypass. Once you see where the blockage is, you're looking right at the heart, at the vessels, you figure out how to clear it out, sew it up, and it's done. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of ways to try and deal with a phobia because the mind is not physical. I can't look into your mind and see it and fix it. There's no MRI, CAT scan, or X-ray that can do that. So your mind is both localized to you, but it's not a material thing. So given that, emotions are hard to pin down because they're not what we think they are, and we can't easily just go and look at them. So to borrow from Dan Siegel, we need to not only know what emotions are, but we need the mind sight to see them in real time to discover those skills and how to apply them. So that's the specificity is what's missing. And we need to do this in schools and we need to do this in various communities in ways that really see it as a fundamental skill like speaking or like, playing a sport or being able to sit through a job interview or anything else. It's all learnable. The challenge around it, of course, is that so many of our core beliefs about who we are, which influence and contain some of these emotions, are baked in from so long ago that it takes a long time to kind of either see them and or to work with them if they need changing.
As you're sharing, I'm wondering, how do we get the buy-in from people? It's not just men, it's also mothers too, right? Wanting to help their children to be more in touch, but mothers too, or women too, may not be fully in touch. So it's going to take time and it's generational. There's just so much work to be done.
If you haven't been taught, you just kind of wing it.
Yeah.
You're imitating what your parents did. You're drawing on past experiences when there were key moments where you learned how to control yourself or how to avoid shame or embarrassment or how to assert yourself. And all the ways that we show up are, from my view, they're all sort of divine ways of protecting ourselves that come from a fundamental desire to be safe and to be whole and to be connected. And so they might not be very effective at doing those things, but they're all coming from that. And that's the beautiful part of it. As we talk about more in terms of how do we develop emotional intelligence and how do we bring men to this mind and heart training without stigma, it's about recognizing that you're fundamentally good, actually. Like life fundamentally wants to live and flourish. Life is living through human beings wanting to fundamentally be safe psychologically, physically,
Right.
to be clear about what our experiences are so we're not confused and overwhelmed, to be able to have agency in the world and to love and be loved, right? Those are fundamentally how life moves through us.
Yes, yes.
So that's the good news that we don't have to see this issue of men being trapped and not knowing how to understand their own emotional lives and act from wisdom and compassion as a problem so much as a puzzle to invite the better parts of themselves forward and be more
That kind of thinking feels really optimistic
mhm,
and like possible and doable, right?
100%. Yeah. And my practice is about 75%, man. And it's just amazing to see what happens when the burden of I don't have to hide this anymore
Right?
becomes known. It's like watching, an artist discover that they're talented for the first time. It's amazing.
And then the empowerment that comes with connecting to self in all the ways, right? Not just physical strength, but all the feelings that are felt inside, the power that comes from feeling that, processing, releasing, or just gaining strength from that feeling.
Absolutely. It's incredibly empowering. I mean, I think that men in particular are living partial lives. They're really living with a huge part of who they are hidden, and that means that they're often alone at the times that they most need presence of others who support them and can see the best in them. And that's, the aloneness part is really brutal. And I'm sure you've read or are aware of the data around that, that the loneliness epidemic, especially among men, but men over 50 is tremendous. And for the research, they define loneliness as not having at least one person in call up and say, "Hey, I'm having a bad day. Let's go get a beer." And if you're in that category, the loneliness has an effect on the cardiovascular system that is worse than smoking, high blood pressure, and obesity combined.
Wow.
So if we all know those are bad for us, right? And we shrug off the loneliness, not realizing what we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah. Well, this kind of segues into the other topic that we wanted to talk about. If men have a difficult time connecting to their emotions, then how does that affect dating and meeting people and finding those meaningful connections, right?
Hmm.
So let me ask you, with more women becoming successful, educated, and independent, how do you think the shift is impacting the way men approach dating? How do you see the traditional gender roles and relationships evolving?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. It's a complicated question. Of course, again, there's so many unique differences among individuals. But I think in general, what I notice is men are always trying to protect themselves because they want to be, if they're dating, dating is very vulnerable. Everyone is worried
Yes.
about being rejected or ghosted or put on a lower tier of importance among all the other people they're dating, right? So it's a challenging place to be for anybody. And I think the more educated and self-actualized a woman is, the more intimidating that can be for a man who isn't also on some similar level of development, right? So that ends up activating behaviors of being less of a good listener, more trying to impress by, talking about accomplishments or, more transactional, material kinds of things. And it kind of stays more surface. Um, but of course, there are also men who are very much trying to be connected to themselves. And the challenge there is, well, how much do I share about myself? I want to be an emotionally intelligent man in the dating world. And the last time I told someone about, my mom and growing up, I didn't get a third date. So there's this whole thing like, what's the right way to do it?
Right.
How do I do this? How
Yes.
do I manage it?
Right.
And I think that comes down to experience and really trying to understand different types of people. Some people are really psychologically oriented, and those kinds of conversations earlier could be really well met. Other times, people just want to have a good time. They want to get too heavy, too serious, too soon. So all those considerations can come in. But I think the most important work for anyone, male or female, to do is to keep grounding themselves in who they are as they understand it. And then, also learning the dating etiquette. I have a guy right now who is um, a terrific person. He's um, struggled at the end of a relationship, and we started looking at attachment work, and he has a very avoidant attachment style. So when things start to get really intimate and vulnerable, he shuts down and buries himself in work, and that often attracts the person who gets anxious and preoccupied with the proximity, right? It was so close. He was showing me all this love and all this interest, and the chemistry's great. And now he's busy, not available, and so I pursue, right?
Right.
And the more she pursues, the more he's too busy. And so, we've been working hard at helping him understand the avoidance behaviors in a granular way and learning how to recognize emotions and how to understand the difference between emotions and feelings
Mhm.
because the neuroscience shows they're different. And if you don't know they're different, it gets confusing. If you know how to differentiate between emotions and feelings, then there are very clear steps you can take. And he just had an experience where he was dating the girl he thought he could really get serious long term with, and he shared too much too soon. And she's just like, wow, this is too much for me. And so he's really suffering from that, really feeling shameful and foolish, and
Mhm.
that the work we're doing
Mhm.
led him to misalign himself around this. And so it's about also reading the person you're with
Right.
and getting a sense of, how much is too much and trying small moves instead of big moves, and then reading the person and then having good communication around it. So it's challenging. It's really, I'm glad I'm not dating now, especially now with social media
I
and
know.
the effect that having a kind of whether it's explicitly disposable or implicitly disposable dating supply is a real problem.
Yeah.
It does not help us treat people the way they really need to be treated with respect. So the ghosting phenomenon is so common. And for men, I think, especially when they're not in touch with themselves, the idea of just there's so many swipes available for me when I get home.
Right.
There's just that sense of I can avoid vulnerability because I got so many options.
Right. That's what I was going to say. It's like this idea now that there are so many options and we can just keep searching until this idealized
Yeah.
version of a person comes along.
Yeah. And even when that person comes along, there is, unfortunately, because of, it's not like you're going to a dating center and sitting on a computer and swiping, and then when you leave it there. It's in your hand all the time.
Right.
And so the process of going to TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and X and then your dating app has a similar dopamine reward cycle. So now you've met the girl you really like, but you still find yourself swiping because you're also like, well, she kind of was a little pissy at the amusement park. So maybe I need to find something like right away. The criticisms of someone that are initially
Yes.
start to appear after the glow wears off can activate an avoidance strategy of, oh, I'm just gonna see what else is going on back here. Maybe
Yes.
there's someone else I'm missing who's a better fit, right? And so it creates this messy mindset that doesn't allow me to actually go deep into seeing the other person clearly, to actually give that person my generosity of awareness and attention, and hopefully receive the same in return, so that I can actually see if this is a relationship I can be in versus
Mhm.
the fragmented attention and the craving that's habitual and that dopamine reward chasing that
Mhm.
often happens. So I think again, I've been married for 25 years and with my wife prior to that total for 32 years, and the idea of dating right now just would be horrifying.
Yes. So the whole technology. So I've been single now for like since 2021. And I haven't wanted to really like date seriously. I've been enjoying my freedom, singlehood, all that. But now I feel like, okay, it's time. It's time for me to like put myself out there, date, whatever. I've tried the dating apps and I was just like, they're not for me, it's just a personal choice. But now I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be more intentional as I'm just in my daily life, like so it's more organic. But one observation that I made is like we're all on our phone all the time. I think before when people used to walk around, they used to like look at each other,
A
make
little
eye
flirting. It was
contact.
kind of fun back in the day, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, like you never knew. But now it's like everybody's looking down. So even if one wanted to, like do that, it's the
No matter.
chances are so slim. And
Yeah.
then I think we're also so now unfamiliar with that or not used to it anymore that to even do that was like, oh my God.
Creates
So, when we
anxiety.
called each other now, it's like, why are they calling me? Like, text me first. How dare you call me? That's weird. It's like
Yeah, I
we're
know. It's really
losing this
changed our behavior.
idea of like that organic face to face connection.
Mm-hmm. I know.
It's interesting.
It is, and it's a bit troubling. Yeah. I don't think it's a better change. I think it's taking away the fundamental thing we need, which is to be able to really be face to face with each other and begin to have our nervous systems co-regulate each other. And that can happen even in just a simple encounter with a stranger. That your nervous system feels safe with me.
Yeah.
That's really important. And you that capacity atrophies the more you spend time looking at your screen.
Mm, so true.
Yeah,
We got some work to do.
we do.
Okay, another question about, women and men. As more women take on leadership roles and a greater financial independence, do you think men are facing a new pressure to redefine what masculinity means in relationships? How are they adapting to this?
Yeah, well, I think, the idea of a woman being a professional is no longer a new one. And I do think that I see a lot of couples as well. And I see a wide variety of things. I see some women who have chosen to either pause careers or leave careers to have children and raise children, and they're happy with that. And I see women who are really ambitious and who want to work and achieve and also have a family. And so, I think men, again, let's just say it this way, because again, I don't have data on this, but some of the men I've seen who have women who work have a hard time recognizing that in certain domestic situations, as they start to argue about things in session, I see attitudes where a man doesn't quite respect the same, like see their wives as a peer, an economic builder in the household. There's some attitudes that are still baked in that I've seen that we have to kind of call out and really excavate some beliefs and attitudes that might still be there. I think there still are lots of men out there who have not come to terms with how to see women as their equals, as their equal partners. And again, I think a big piece of that is the men who do that tend to have much less self-awareness about emotion. When they do, then it's much easier to open, and because here's one of the fundamental principles I think that's helpful for all of us to keep in mind. I can't be emotionally intelligent. I can't be empathic and connected and curious and as needed compassionate for someone else more than I can be for myself. Because again, it's a learned set of skills and understandings. And it's like trying to be a baseball coach if I never played baseball at all. And it doesn't make sense, right? So I've got to know my own stuff. And the men who don't know their own stuff tend to not recognize what's needed in a conflict with a woman who is, working and is a professional and is, has her whole world that she's built. And if he doesn't understand his own stuff, it's gonna be very hard to meet her where she is. So I think again, it points back to the need for a much better education around emotion and self-awareness and self-regulation and recognizing that we are utterly interdependent. We are not, it's a dialectic. We're both responsible for ourselves. We're responsible for our behavior. No one can make us have any particular emotion, especially in particular. Like you can create an atmosphere where my body feels unsafe, but emotions are actually in cognition. And that means that how I think determines the emotion. And you can't control my thinking. So when someone else, does something and I blame them for how I'm experiencing it, that's a lack of emotional understanding. It's actually your interpretation and your reactivity is your responsibility.
Right.
At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we didn't build ourselves, we didn't engineer ourselves. So I'm actually the product of all these other inputs from other human beings. And when I lead meditation practices, I also say, as you're trying to find the breath and you have all these thoughts going through that are distracting you, who's there in your thoughts? Oh, colleagues, family members, people you care about. Your mind is woven with human beings. So we're both responsible for ourselves, but we're also the product of all these influences of others, and we influence others. So it's this dialectical balance between being an individual and being interconnected. And that part is really important to understand as I study my own emotions to become more empathic. Because if I'm going to be dating someone or be in a relationship with someone who is in many ways my peer, I need to be able to understand all the stuff that's going on inside myself to give that person the honor and generosity of my attention and my respect. Right. So it's a complicated job in one way, but in another way, doing those work that we're talking about, that we're indicating, changes your whole life. It changes all your relationships. It changes how you show up to work. It changes how you take care of yourself, how you parent. So it's actually fundamental to everything.
Yeah. And how the world responds to you.
Absolutely.
So it's,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So, since there is a lot of stigma around men seeking therapy or embracing self care, how can we begin to change the narrative and encouragement to see mental health care as a strength rather than a weakness?
Yeah. Well, I was just listening to the Huberman Lab podcast on the way here, and he had on a professor of psychology from Yale, and they were talking about how, again, emotional intelligence is a set of skills,
Yes.
and there are levels of impact. So if you want to be better at work, less stressed out, if you have a difficult boss, if you're not as aggressive as you'd like to be in sales, if you are trying to get back to um, a level of fitness after having kids, if you are trying to tolerate being with your in-laws over a vacation, or if you're trying to be more at ease and more in flow instead of grinding it and pushing yourself. Typically, that's happening with a lot of negative self-talk and judgment. If you want to be happier, healthier, and more effective, this is for you. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And luckily, we've seen lots and lots of people recently come out about their mental illnesses and how they're treating them from the sports world or from entertainment, or people who are icons, right? Men who are not afraid to say, yeah, I have borderline personality disorder, or, I get depressed. Michael Phelps talking about his depression and treating it with cannabis instead of with therapy, and how he's benefited from it. Um, and also in the mindfulness world, we've seen that mindfulness has been a huge part of training the Chicago Bulls and the LA Lakers and many other sports teams now. And I train police officers. I trained the FBI's hostage rescue team. That team is the highest level um, police force that has military training in the country, and their difficult job is to extract hostages alive when the hostage negotiators fail, right? So they basically have to go in and kill the bad guys and pull out the good guys. It's an extremely stressful task. And so they value mindfulness training because it helps them regulate their emotions. It helps them stay in tune with each other as one unit as they're moving in very difficult environments with extreme situational awareness. And it also helps them decompress so that when they go home to their families, they're not unavailable. They're actually available. One of the uh, operators came to me during a break of our training, and he said, I walk into the house and my kids don't even look up because they could feel I'm tense. I've
Mm,
been gone for a long time, and I feel like I'm losing them. What do I do? You know? And so, in fact, so many of these FBI hostage rescue team members were really interested in, how do I heal my families? How do I heal the people around me? Because I can't just unplug,
right.
right? So, if you want to perform well in life, if you want to have a rich, adventurous life, and if you want to not suppress the things that are happening to you when they're bad, but experience them and grow from them, then you need to do this work.
Yes, yes. I love how you're framing all of this. It's really just a strength-based approach. I know most of the time either people come to you or it's through these organizations, but how can we encourage men who may not be apt to seek this out?
Mm-hmm.
How do we
Mm-hmm.
encourage them or bring them in?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, we could look at it developmentally. So it all starts with what happens at home. So as young parents, we could really think about, oh, how am I modeling emotional intelligence for my children?
Mhm.
That's really huge. And a lot of it has to do with, again, a nervous system bottom up approach, which is we don't learn at all when we're in fight or flight. We learn when we're in parasympathetic calm. So learning just that alone, how to calm oneself down as a tired, stressed out, multitasking parent to self-regulate and then to help regulate the nervous system of my child. And then the learning and teaching moments happen later. And that's a really great cue to what's needed for adults and for kids. We, of course, have social emotional learning programs in schools across the country. That's doing a lot of good work. Um, Podcasts like this, of course, public education, really, really important. And also, one of my dear friends is part of the Norman Lear Center for Hollywood Health and Society. And what they do is they're a clearinghouse of researchers who help writers learn more about global warming or toxic water or suicide or pregnancy. And mental health for men is another topic. So the more writers can actually write great shows that model it, because we are, if you think about it again, back to our earlier discussion about how babies are completely without instincts and they model everything and they learn from absorbing the world around them. It's really helpful, even as we are adults, to see what it looks like for a man to be both strong and vulnerable. One of the shows I love to watch is The Bear, and the actor Jeremy White plays Carmy, who is a really intelligent, really sensitive younger sibling in this very, very difficult family, working class family, and he inherits his brother's little hoagie diner after his brother commits suicide, takes his
Oh.
life. And it turns out that Carmi has left the family to go become a top chef at all these great gourmet schools and restaurants. And so now he's got this little diner that's populated by all the local neighborhood folks who know him since he's a kid, and they've all kind of turned their nose up to him because he went off to become a blue blood, chef in a great, restaurant and so forth. So now he's coming back to try and turn this into something amazing, have his own thing. But he's got to go against cultural boundaries and the ways that people have seen him growing up. And I think that the character Carmi is a great example of what happens when you have been traumatized in a family. You've been pigeonholed as a certain way, and no one's taught you about your emotions, but you're an incredibly sensitive and good person. And so, what we see the character do over and over again is internalize his drive to be excellent and try and focus on precision and the high level of training he's received. At the same time, he's being bombarded by what has always gotten him through, which is berating himself, judging himself, pushing himself, doubting himself. And you see this incredible struggle inside. So it's a great example of, wow, he's a good person. He's extremely talented. He's extremely ambitious. And we see him suffer because he doesn't know how to deal with all this stuff. And so that's a great example where we love this guy. We want him to succeed. And we also, probably a lot of guys are seeing going, damn, that's me. So that validates it, right? Because he's such a beloved character in the show. And we all in the audience love him and we want to help him. And as a man, seeing that, it's so validating to realize I'm not the only one. And it's also like he's suffering way more than he needs to. I wonder if I am, right? So having those examples and models out in the world are really, really important. And then I think the general conversation has been better and better around mental health. Um, Even, in the advertising for the Huberman Lab podcast, he was advertising for BetterHelp, the online therapy service, and he was saying how he's been in weekly therapy for 30 years, and he sees it as, and whether I have a problem or not, it's all about, oh, I get to have an hour about me. How do I think? How do I see the world? How do I understand things? How can I be better? How can I have a growth mindset? So I think, again, it's like, personal trainer, doctor, therapist, nutritionist. It's all part of thriving and
And taking
flourishing.
care of the self. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's nothing to be ashamed of because
Mhm.
all of the behaviors that you love to change about yourself, all the ways that you kind of fight yourself are actually coming from parts of you that are good, that want to be whole and healthy and connected. It's just that if you don't know how to do that, then you're going to have these instinctive ways, maybe imitative ways that aren't effective. But it's coming from wanting to be good.
Right. What would you say to someone that's like, I know I need it, but I'm afraid that if I start doing the work, I may fall apart or it may feel like too much, right? Years of holding in can feel really scary to then
Mhm.
even try to release. So, what would you tell somebody?
Yeah, well, I think everyone has that fear. It's funny. It's almost like the same fear around psychedelic medicine and psychedelic assistance therapy, that it's about losing control,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Everyone is afraid of losing control. And so that's a real possibility and probably a necessity in psychedelic assisted therapy. But in terms of talk therapy, losing control is a really interesting phenomena because what that to me points to is again this misunderstanding between what emotions are and what feelings are and the lack of connection to the body. We are we're born into this world. Our first set of inputs that we could call a language is sensory.
Mm.
It's seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching,
Yeah.
feeling the internal sense, the interoception of the body. And so if you look at a baby, it's so amazing because they're just having all these reactions and there's no language, there's no reference point. There's no, the brain is a predictive processor. So when I see a microphone, I only know it's a microphone because of my past experience.
Mm.
It's always trying to predict what that is based on the best guess of what it's most like from my past experience.
Yeah.
Babies have no past experience whatsoever, right? So they come into this world a pure sensory being, but by the time they get to be, 4 or 5 years old, all the sensory stuff is intermittently tiled over with language that diminishes the depth of that experience of the sensory body. By the time you get to high school, you're living in your head. You're living in stories, and they're tribal stories, which is important. But the balance has been lost for most people, unless you're an athlete or a dancer or just naturally have a lot of somatic embodiment. So part of our work then to help someone not feel out of control is to understand the relationship between cognition, which is where emotions live. Emotions are words to describe what it's like to be in a very precise situation. So, and we don't get taught that, and we don't get taught what we call emotion granularity, which is, if you ask men to write out the emotions they experience throughout a week, you'll get three or four, maybe. And anger is one of them typically. And there are so many different subsets of that family of emotion: indignation, frustration, irritation, rage. All these different words
Yeah.
don't live in different parts of your brain or in your body anywhere. They are culturally assigned meanings that apply to certain kinds of situations. So if I know that, I can start to really think about, oh, is it really that I'm irritated, or am I actually indignant because this person is doubting my skill as I presented this presentation at work? So that helps me actually think about it more precisely. And then I know more what to do with it. But feelings and affects are actually what we're born with. We're not born with emotions because we're not born with language. And this is kind of a hard one for people to kind of wrap their heads around. But
Interesting.
you're born with fundamental feelings of pleasantness, unpleasantness, neutral feelings, feelings of hunger, satiety, feelings of calmness or agitation, pain or pleasure, um, sleepiness or alertness, safety or threat. Those are all there 24/7, and your brain is monitoring them constantly. But emotions are language based, they're culturally based, and they're educational. So when we talk about losing control in a therapy session, when I start to actually say, okay, let's first start with the fundamentals, which are always here, which is how do you feel? And when I ask a guy how he feels, he's like, I don't know. Where do I look for that? So close your eyes. Are you tired or alert? Are you hungry or are you not hungry? Are you calm or are you agitated? Do you feel present or scattered? And they answer the questions like that's how you feel.
Right.
It's right here. It's tangible. And the problem is that we're really imprecise around the language because we're not well educated on it. And it's also because the mind is not physical. And there's a lot of research on emotion that has been good pioneering work, but not until very recently have we realized that emotion and cognition are inseparable. And that means it's hard to find if I don't know how to look for it and if I haven't had an education. So once we learn how to regulate the body and calm the body, and we realize that certain thoughts will activate my heart rate, make my stomach get tight, maybe I'll get an adrenaline burst up my solar plexus. I learn how to regulate that, bring my attention back from those thoughts, and calm myself. And so we start there first. And then we start to go into the areas that might be challenging, and we keep kind of pendulating from the difficult topic back to calming the body. And all of a sudden, now they feel they have a sense of, I always tell them it's not perfect control unless you want to be a yogi in the caves and do that for 30 years, but you will have more regulation and more influence over your body. And that tends to prevent that fear of losing control.
That's really helpful to know that it is possible. There are steps to take. It's not going to be having to fall apart, right? Because sometimes that's the idea too, that you have to fall apart to be able to put yourself together. But what you're offering are all alternatives that there could be like a slower pace so that
Mhm.
it's not so scary or overwhelming.
That's right. And once we achieve that sense that, oh, I'm not going to lose control, and they start to touch in on the sense that they actually have experiences that they have put in a hurt locker and they don't have contact with. And that, in fact, if they did surrender to grief or to shame or to loneliness and let themselves cry and actually experience it in the body, that and experience it with a witness who is holding them in really high esteem for even having the courage to get to that place, they need to have these intermediate steps where they actually feel like they can tiptoe toward it and pull back. It's like exposure therapy, really.
Yes.
You're getting exposed to the ideas, and you start to have some safety around it. Your safe words, and then you get closer and closer to the hot spot, and then finally, when you have courage, you let it happen.
Yes.
And sometimes it just, it'll sneak up on you in a session, but they've done the work. And that's why it shows up without even a therapist bringing it up or they bring it up. So it's a process. But I think if we can look at it that way, um, it's really empowering and really healing. And then what I notice is that they start to be, when they really can do this work, they start to be better friends to their guys.
Yeah.
I never had a circle of friends in high school. I was always like, 'cause I had a lot of social anxiety. So I had a friend and then I would have their friends, but I wouldn't see any of those people outside that dyad relationship. So I had a bunch of little satellite friendships that I would be invited to their circles, but never had my own little circle. And so it took really years. I'm 58 now, but now I have a group of 5 guys who are all professionals, and they're all deep thinkers, deeply feeling guys, and super masculine guys. Like they're really cool. And it's just amazing to see, like, you guys are the models here for so many people out there where you're great at holding boundaries, you're great at, talking a little smack when it's time to talk smack. You're athletes, you're healers, you're builders, you're computer graphic scientists, and you can cry and you're not ashamed. You're not ashamed to say, hey, I'm really struggling as a dad right now. I'm feeling rejected by my kid. And bums me out, and I don't have to do with it sometimes, and there's no shame.
Good.
Instead, you
Yeah.
got this tribe
Yes.
of healing that happens.
That's so necessary. And it brings me to the next question. So, for somebody who is yearning for that connection, but it may not be accessible through their family system or immediate community, like their friends aren't into this, what exists out there for them that they can either Google search or find for themselves?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm gonna have to just kind of talk off the top of my head because I haven't done that myself, but I do know over the years I have been exposed to guys who have told me that there are a number of great men's groups out there that include contemplative work, so there are a number of people who are both therapists as well as coaches and like counselors and even some martial arts teachers who exemplify this, and they kind of that's the cornerstone of why they get together. So looking for men's groups, I think, is the key thing. And sometimes, you can find amazing martial arts communities where that, I mean, it's the perfect place to find that balance,
Mhm.
because ostensibly we're there to learn how to be deadly and have self-discipline. But when you can combine that with the authenticity of the human experience, it's the ultimate expression of it. I remember an example of this because I've been studying martial arts since I'm 7 years old, so 51 years. And one of my teachers is a guy named Danny Nasanto, who is a Filipino martial arts master, well renowned. Travels probably, before COVID, he was traveling 40 weekends a year, teaching all around the world. And he was Bruce Lee's best friend and collaborator in developing Bruce Lee's fighting philosophy called Jeet Kune Do. And so he teaches all kinds of martial arts. And every year he has a seminar with other teachers visiting. And I was at the seminar one day, and we were doing a drill to this music, and all of a sudden the music got shut off, and he was on the phone. We just kept on working. And then he called us to stop, and he said Kobe Bryant had just died in a helicopter accident. And we're breaking for lunch early, and we'll see you when you get back. And so we're all blown away. We get to our phones, we're looking at it, and we start walking to the restaurants, and we couldn't believe it. Then one of the advanced students there at lunch said that Danny Nasanto was very close with Kobe. He had trained his bodyguards in martial arts and weapons training for years, and it was a personal loss for him. So when we walk back from the restaurant, the martial arts studio is kind of like a garage with a big corrugated metal door that opens up, right? So it's all open, and there's a parking lot there. And right there at the opening, there's Danny DeSanto, this 80 something master of martial arts, one of the most deadly guys on the planet at that age, sitting in this lawn chair weeping. And it was amazing to see because he could have been in his office in private, not showing his grief.
Right.
Instead, he's like, I'm proud that I love him, and I'm devastated for his family and for my personal loss. And it was just amazing to see. It was like, okay, that's a man.
And that's authenticity. That's him experiencing that
Exactly.
moment fully. Wow.
Exactly.
And how powerful, right? That
Yeah.
his choice affected
Yeah.
all of you.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Great
There's
wisdom.
no shame in loving, and there's no shame in grief. It's real. It's real.
It's real.
It needs to be experienced. And, you know, working with first responders, working with paramilitary, working with the surgeons at UCLA, they're all in critical incident situations where they can't let distraction get in the way. The problem is that the way that they do that typically is through kind of a brute force inside that's hard to turn off.
Mm,
And, you wouldn't think that surgeons would be people who are among the highest stress levels in terms of not the stress of the job, but the life stress that corrodes their life experience. But there was a Harvard surgeon who ended up being the head of Johns Hopkins Hospital Surgery Center who took his own life. On paper, he had everything. He was publishing great research, doing amazing surgery, teaching residents, highest pedigrees you could have, one of the best institutions in the country. and he took his own life in an OR, hanging himself with ligature, surgical ligature, as a symbol of this field is killing us, right? Because we're not taught how to process
Mm.
all the pressure, all the ways that we bend ourselves into the shape of success, and how we don't process when something goes wrong and it's our fault, right? So we need this work desperately to show that it's okay to actually be sad or have grief or have self-doubt or fall into depression. Those are all normal human experiences
Right.
that are all signs of your own mind and body wanting to find equilibrium, wanting to find home again. So there's no shame in it. It's like, well, okay, if you lose a friend and you get sad, it's no different than twisting your ankle and having swelling.
Right.
It's the same thing.
Right. Exactly.
Don't be
That's
ashamed
what
of
I
it.
tell people too. It's like if we had a response to a physical injury, we allow that. But
Mm-hmm.
if we have an emotional response to some other type of injury, it's like we don't allow ourselves that. But it's a response to something that's happened. So
Yeah,
why not normalize it?
exactly, exactly. Yeah, and the thing is that I think again because we're not valuing that from a skill set point of view. When you're really skillful, there's something profoundly powerful about being with someone who is simultaneously holding themselves in dignity and strength while also expressing their grief or their sorrow or their worry or their struggle because it's a dialectical balance of like whole human. This person isn't, needing more than I can give in this moment. Let's say this is kind of what I'm imagining is a person who's strong in their grief or strong in their fear, right? Because they know that they're gripped by something, but they also know that one or the other, they'll get the help they need and they'll get through it. And that combination is like magnetizing. It's so attractive because they're not putting it all on us or we have to solve it for them. And it's not like this huge nightmare mess. And we're all there sometimes. That's okay. But when you really do this work, what I find is the vulnerability plus the strength is always there.
Yes.
And it's really powerful. It's really powerful.
Well, I want to encourage listeners if they're wondering how to start this work, there are so many options. Like you said, there are men groups, masculine communities, whether it's like through martial arts or sports, or just also them being able to create that for themselves if they need. But seeking, yeah, mental health, therapy,
I
support,
would suggest too, mindfulness practices. Mindfulness
mindfulness
practice
practice.
groups are really refining your ability to sit with your experience and learn how to deconstruct your experience so you recognize the difference between emotions and feelings and reactivity and how to be non-reactive, non-judgmental, open and curious with yourself. So it's a wonderful way to do it. When I started teaching mindfulness back in 2011, I'd have classes of 30 people and maybe there'd be three guys and almost all of them would say either my therapist wants me to be here or my wife brought me. And now when I teach, it's half and half. So they're starting to realize, oh, I need this. And when I have artists come, actors come, they're like, I need to know how to get in connection with myself. And so it's becoming more and more available. So mindfulness is a great entry point for this work.
Yes, yes. And breath work has been so powerful for me in healing. Like that's another one that I truly recommend if somebody can. There's a lot of male breathwork practitioners that people can find that connects you to your body, that helps release emotion. There's not a lot of thinking or words that are necessary. It's more about just feeling and releasing. And then it has the meditative quality towards the end where they just get to allow their body to be in this meditative state and receive information. It's a beautiful experience too. And we have events here at the Mo Collective Sanctuary too, where people can come and we've had we've had men come and it's been so beautiful to see them be able to open up and feel safe and share and find the value in this. And so you and I are talking about creating a space for men, bringing you in and maybe another male practitioner that can help support this work, right, for men and just make more events, more accessible so that If it's continuously in people's faces, then they're more likely to be like, okay, it's there. And maybe one day they'll show up, right?
Mhm.
That's the important
Absolutely.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been such a great conversation. You've had such valuable insight. So thank you again. And I want to thank the audience for taking the time to listen and being engaged with us. This is a really important topic, and I hope that this moves somebody or motivates them in a positive way.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah. It's a really, really important for all of our men, boys, and all of the women and other men they love, right?
Hmm.
So absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Happy to
Yeah.
be here.
Well, thanks again. And thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Thank you for joining me on the Moon Collective Sanctuary. Remember, your journey to a more fulfilling and empowered life continues beyond this episode. Until next time, may you remember who you are and stay open to embrace all that life has to offer. Ready to dive deeper into your journey of self-discovery? Join us for a transformative retreat at the Moon Collective Sanctuary. Visit mooncollectivesanctuary.com to learn more and book your spot.